Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming on this nicest day of the year so far, I think. Our Schulman lecturer for today is Professor Ian Phillips. Ian has taught in the philosophy departments at Oxford, where I think he got his undergraduate degrees, at University College London, where I believe he got his PhD, in the University of Birmingham. He's also taught in the cognitive science program at Princeton. For the last several years, he has been the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor at Johns Hopkins University. And this is not just a fancy title, but it's actually sort of a new, exciting kind of thing. Bloomberg professors must be fully cross-appointed in multiple departments. And so Ian is a professor of philosophy and also a professor of psychological and brain sciences. Ian is one of our field's leading philosophers of perception. He works on many, many different topics with a special focus on the perception of time, visual adaptation, blind sight, object representations, many different aspects of visual awareness and the lack thereof. And he also does some intriguing secret work on silences and shadows. But that work is classified. He's won all sorts of prizes for this work. His work has been selected for the Philosopher's Annual, which selects the 10 best philosophy papers each year. He's won a Philip Leverhulme Prize, and I think he actually specializes in academic awards which have many, many syllables. He has won the William James Prize for contributions to the scientific study of consciousness from the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness.
Who else?
And last year, he won the Phi Beta Kappa Society and American Philosophical Association Lebowitz Prize for philosophical achievement and contributions. This last one was co-awarded with Ned Block. And I think usually when prizes in our fields are co-awarded, that means that a committee couldn't make up their mind, or maybe it was a team. But as far as I can tell, you got that prize with Ned for just arguing with him in print about everything. And really improving our field in the process. Ian is a model not just of how to make substantive philosophical contributions, but how to have a dispute in our field in a super productive, award-winning way. In closing, I want to suggest that Ian is justifiably renowned in all these ways, not just for his substantive contributions, but for the way that he's doing the philosophy of perception, which is pretty exciting. This Schulman series is about the intersection between the sciences and the humanities. And of course, there's been quite a lot of such interaction generally between philosophy and psychology. But I think there is a sort of dark secret in that, which is that there's still quite an asymmetry in one way, which is that increasingly today there are, I think, a great many philosophers who are paying close, careful attention to what's going on in the psychological literature. But there are really far fewer psychologists who are paying close, careful attention to what's going on in the philosophical literature. And Ian really breaks this mold. His work is, of course, very well cited in philosophy, which is not so unusual. But what's more special is that his work is increasingly making a real difference and racking up all sorts of citations in psychology and neuroscience. And it's really because he's doing this work in a different way. As a vision scientist, it's sort of easy to have a love-hate relationship with the philosophy of perception. And that's in part because so much philosophy of perception has been done by people who know about the Mueller-Lyer illusion and that gorilla experiment. And that's basically all it takes. In fact, one of those, you could write a book on it, as far as I can tell. But Ian, in stark contrast, has been really paying attention to the nitty-gritty of all of this work. I'm pretty sure he knows parts of our field better than those of us who are actually in the trenches doing this work. And most importantly, he's doing philosophical work which shows how those details can really matter, as I think we'll hear about today. Please welcome Ian Phillips.
Okay, thank you so much, Brian, for that incredibly kind introduction. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you for coming in this gorgeous weather. So today I want to begin with a passage from the philosopher Andy Clark, in which he gives voice to what he takes to be our naive or intuitive, though in Clark's view completely false, vision of how our mental lives unfold. So this is what Clark says. Our human mental life looks to involve a seamless unfolding of perception, action, and experience. a golden braid in which each element twines intimately with the rest. We see the very world we act in, and we act in the very world we see. But more than this, visual experience presents us with the world in a way apt for the control and fine guidance of action. So I think there are kind of three core ideas here in the Clark. The first is just that all perception is conscious perception. Okay, that being the most intimate entwining of perception and experience. So to see, or to hear and so forth, is just to perceptually experience the world. The second thought is that, if you like, all worldly action guidance is perceptual. So insofar as the world informs you as an agent in the course of engaging in some action, it informs us exclusively through perceptual channels. And the final thought is something like this, that all perception is available for action guidance. So that's a kind of minimal access condition, if you like, on perceptual experience. Okay, so we see the world we act in the world we see. Now, anyone who's at all familiar with the cognitive science of the last 50 years will know that it has uncovered what many regard as repeated and decisive counterexamples to these ideas. Okay, so grounds for unbraiding this braid. In particular, work in cognitive neuropsychology has witnessed apparently striking dissociations of action and awareness in conditions like blindsight, unilateral neglect, and visual form agnosia. And psychophysical work with neurotypical subjects has uncovered extensive evidence of visual processing in the absence of awareness. So most notably studies of subliminal priming, and also in the domain of visually guided action. And over the last several years, I've pressed really a dilemma against the idea that perception and consciousness dissociate, which really divides over a simple question. So take any case where you've allegedly got some coming apart of perception, experience, or action. How did you measure whether experience was really there or not? How did you establish the absence of awareness? So there are two broad categories of things you might do. You might use so-called subjective measures, or you might use objective measures. So let's take the first horn. So if we use so-called subjective measures to assess awareness, so we just simply ask subjects, did you see anything or not, or were you conscious of anything or not, then a notorious concern arises. It's often called the problem of the criterion. It goes back to early signal detection theorists. And as it manifests in this particular context, it's just the concern that subjects might underestimate their conscious experience. And so what I want to do now in the first sort of substantial chunk of the talk is illustrate that concern with respect to a particular case, namely the case of blindsight that Brian mentioned. Okay, so back in the 70s, researchers, most notably Larry Weisskranz, at Oxford, began extensive investigation of a really astonishing condition which remains the most discussed neuropsychological case in both the contemporary science and philosophy of consciousness. And this is work, if you're interested, that's wonderfully summarized in the third edition of this landmark book, Blindsight by Weisskranz. As I'm sure many of you know, blindsight is a condition caused by destruction of an area of the brain called primary visual cortex. It's an area at the back of the brain, which is kind of the first port of call, or the first cortical port of call of visual signals from the eyes. And here you can see two scans of two patients. The most extensively investigated patient, GY, who as a child had a road traffic accident leading to a lesion of almost all of V1, primary visual cortex, in his left hemisphere here. And then a fascinating but much less explored patient, TN, who had the misfortune of having two strokes roughly 30 days apart, and so lost actually more than just primary visual cortex, but primary visual cortex on first one side and then the other side of his brain. So he has bilateral blindsight. Okay, and because of the organization of the primate visual system, the damage to a region of V1 leads to so-called contralateral or opposite side field deficits. So patient GY here with a left lesion has severe deficits with perception on the right. So given that damage, it's not that surprising, you might think, that subjects with blindsight with such lesions say they're blind in the corresponding areas. So if you ask GY, as he is asked in an interview, what happened to him, he just says, well, I've lost all the vision to my right. And in the clinic, that's confirmed by what's called perimetry probably an exam that many of you have had yourselves, where the clinician just presents, in this case, bright, high contrast white stimuli at various locations in that blind right visual field. And what you're seeing here in this kind of plot, these white circles along the vertical meridian, and at the center here are cases where GY has said yes by a button press. I saw the high contrast stimulus, but these black radii are cases where he said no. So it looks to all purposes that he's just blind in the vast majority of his right visual field. But of course, that's not the whole story. There's a huge amount of work on patients like GY establishing that there's actually quite extensive visual function that remains after this damage. So there's evidence of his capacity to discriminate motion, in particular left-right or horizontal-vertical motion. With another patient, studies that show he's able to discriminate the orientation of a line or an X from an O. There's work on affective blind sight showing that GY can distinguish between happy and sad emotionally expressed emotions, facially expressed emotions. And again with GY that he can detect simple high contrast stimuli in his blind field. So I mentioned before the patient TN, and this is perhaps the most dramatic example of preserved visual function. So remember, TN has complete bilateral blind sight, so denies being able to see anything in a perimetry exam. But this is a video of him walking down a corridor, and that's Weisskranz closely shadowing him behind. And as you'll see, he's able to navigate these kind of bits of office paraphernalia that have been put in his path pretty effectively, despite saying, I have no idea how I did this, I'm completely blind. And this kind of performance has led many to question kind of what's the point of being conscious? If you can get around the world like this without being conscious, then why are we conscious? Okay, so whatever exactly you think, an extremely common view is that blindsight is revolutionary. So here's Weisskranz in retrospect describing how back in the 70s it was just immediately obvious to him and his colleagues that the phenomenon of successful performance without awareness across a startlingly broad range of visual tasks just must have a bearing on the neural and philosophical aspects of consciousness. And here's the philosopher Pat Churchland actually writing in the context of Weisskranz's work of how the revolutionary blindsight results just knocked the stuffing out of the obvious assumption that awareness of a signal is necessary for an intentional response to that signal. And that's just part of the Golden Braid conception, that we need to be aware of things if we're going to act in response to them in the world. So, first question, does blindsight show that the Golden Braid is mistaken? Well, in fact, there's a simple and powerful alternative way of thinking about blindsight, but one I think that's been unjustly neglected. And so to approach this kind of alternative picture, notice first that the tasks used to establish the absence of awareness in blindsight are subjective measures. So in the perimetry exam I mentioned before, GY is just being asked, did you see anything or not following the presentation of a stimulus? And that kind of question is subject to what is known as conservative response bias. So let me just illustrate that. And I want you to think of yourself as a blindsight patient, like GY. And so you have, by any objective measure, extremely degraded vision in your right-hand visual field. Okay, so you have pretty normal vision on your left-hand field. That's how you get around the world normally. But in your right-hand field, you don't see colors. You don't really see visual form at all. You don't really see objects in any real sense. Maybe you just have a sense somehow. I mean, I'm not saying this is conscious at this point, but just the objective measures are, of you being able to detect extremely high contrast or extremely kind of salient stimuli only. So the experimenter asks you, after the presentation of some stimulus, did you see anything on that trial? And what are you supposed to make of that question? You might think, maybe this is a sort of somewhat philosophical kind of question, and philosophers do not agree on the answer to this question. What does it take to see something? What does it mean to see something? I mean, that's just being handed over to me to make a decision about that. How sure do I have to be that what has just happened to me counts as a case of seeing? How sure do I have to be that there was a stimulus there to say yes, and so on? And maybe you think something like this. well, the experience I had was just nothing like seeing something in my sighted field, so, quotes, normal seeing, so I should probably say no. Or you might think, well, I had some really vague awareness, but I wouldn't say I saw anything specific, so I guess I'll say no. Or you might think, I'm not sure whether I saw something or not, so maybe I'll play it safe and I'll say no. Okay, so for all of those reasons and many others, you might think a negative response in an exam like this needn't be taken as a guarantee that there was absolutely no awareness. Because there's this other factor, namely all that decisional thinking that goes on after your experience that we need to take into account. Okay, so that's the tasks that are used to assess awareness. What about the tasks that are used to assess residual visual capacity? Well, these are typically so-called forced choice or maybe forced response tasks. And these are effectively, at least the forced choice tasks, effectively bias-free. So let me say what I mean by that. So in a forced choice task, you're presented with, in a two alternative case, two temporal or spatial intervals. So there's going to be a stimulus in just one of those two intervals, and you have to choose which. And so here, I mean, I have no idea how these slides appear to you and whether it's completely obvious to you that there's a patch in one and not in the other. But suppose that they were presented to you on their own, and you might think, well, I don't think I can see anything in either of those. So each interval presented on its own is one such that you would say, no, I don't see anything. But you don't have that option here of saying, no, there's nothing there, I don't see anything. You have to choose which of these the stimulus is in. And you know there is a stimulus in one of them. So what do? Well, you naturally pick whichever interval it is that's most likely to contain a stimulus. Perhaps you might think that which just gave you that dimmest flicker or hint of awareness of there being something there. Okay, so you might think that, but you have to choose. So you think maybe there was something faint in the first and you go for that. So I hope it's clear, even from this brief presentation, that these forced choice tasks are kind of a great tool for a psychophysicist to ascertain a subject's sensitivity independent of their bias, because bias doesn't really factor into this. Unless you have a particular preference for interval 1s over interval 2s, there's no question of conservative criterion coming in. Okay, so that kind of framework sets up the thought that actually all the data concerning Blindside is consistent with a picture on which what the brain damage has done is to severely and maybe qualitatively degrade the subject's vision in their blind field, perhaps to the point where it's just too weak or degraded or qualitatively different to count to them as seeing. As I say, there's no color, no form, no objects, and so on. But nonetheless, there is a conscious signal there which is sufficient to perform above chance when you force the subject to make a decision between two alternatives. So I can't give a full defense of that viewpoint here, but I just want to give you three sort of, almost tantalizing teaser bits of evidence that make me think this hypothesis is on the right lines. So one important thing to notice is that blind sight patients do report awareness, especially when the question is changed subtly. And what I think maybe the question change is about is the question change elicits a different, more liberal criterion in the subject. So they're more prepared to say yes to this question than the others. So here I mentioned slightly misleadingly that this was the perimetry plot from this paper. And it is the classic perimetry plot in all the early papers on Blindside. There's the kind of plot you see for GY. But these experimentalists also asked a different question with just the same stimuli in a second block. So that different question was just press when you're aware of something. So we had press when you see something, nothing, press when you're aware of something. And suddenly you get all these positive responses. Okay, so there's clearly some kind of awareness in much of the visual field if you trust these answers. Second kind of bit of evidence. Usually blind sight patients in these experiments are given a binary choice between yes and no responses. They can either say, yes, I saw it, or no, I didn't see it. But what happens when we give a blind sight subject a more fine-grained response scale? So this is a study done by Matzi and colleagues with a different patient, a woman called SL. And what they did was just give her a batch of different discrimination tasks, like orientation, color, and so on, discrimination tasks. And after every trial, asked her, did you do that task by seeing the stimulus, or were you just guessing? So a standard yes-no measure. And what they found was that in the black bars indicate I was just guessing, so no responses, that only in one of the cases here did she acknowledge that she was seeing anything and that was driving her responses. But then again, they did exactly the same discrimination tasks, but affording her the luxury of being able to respond in 4 different ways. So she could say, I had no experience, I had weak experience, I had almost clear experience, or I had clear experience. And this is what happened. It turned out that the black bars, which are indicating guessed responses, so no, I didn't have any experiences, actually look like they comprise both 0, so no experience, but also this dark grey, i.e. weak experience. And similarly, the yes, I saw something corresponds here to almost clear experience. So it looks like what the subject has been doing with their yes, no is using no to mean none or weak, and the yes to mean clear or almost clear. And it's a little hard to tell too much from this particular study because the performance is quite low across the board, but there was no evidence of above chance performance just looking at the cases where no experience at all was reported. There had to at least be weak experience reported before one got any performance. Okay, final bit of teaser evidence. This is from a study by Zeki and Fish of GY, and they gave him a whole bunch of different kind of conditions, and in particular, in one particular very low contrast condition, he just spontaneously responds. I mean, he knows his experimenters very well. Hey, my awareness score in this particular block should be, quotes, -1 or -2. And I think what that really tells you is that his 0 was not absolute 0, if he's prepared to give -1 and -2 responses. Okay, so in general, I hope that gives you some sense that the judgments of awareness are one should be suspicious about, and it turns out that there is awareness there if you really find the right ways at it. And I think there's a case to be made that correlates quite well with performance also. But if you want a really systematic and sustained defense of that view against lots of psychophysical objections, then let me advertise this paper. Okay, whatever one thinks of blindsight, the residual vision is really very limited. So, there are sometimes anecdotes about how a blindsighted patient wouldn't reach out for a glass of water if they were thirsty. Well, that's because they can't see objects. So, I mean, there's no vision capable of anything like that kind of richness. But in the 80s, researchers interested in a rather different condition reported evidence of, as they put it, unconscious perceptual analysis far more extensive than are dreamt of in most current theories. And the most current theories were precisely the theories that were being motivated by blindsight. So this is evidence from a condition called neglect. And neglect is a really complicated and kind of fractionated disorder. It's associated to much later damage in the visual hierarchy. So typically it follows a stroke, and it's associated with damage to kind of right inferior parietal and temporoparietal regions. And it's characterized by a failure to respond or report or attend to or orient to significant stimuli on the other side of space. And where that's not due to you not being able to see in some elementary sense, there's no damage to your eyes or very early visual areas, nor to being able to respond in the kind of other end of things in a motor way. And you often see these kinds of pictures in textbooks. So this is a picture of a house, and the patient has just been asked to copy it. And you can see they've just failed to copy out the left-hand side. Here they've been asked to bisect a line, and you can see that they've bisected it too far to the right, as if they're ignoring this part of the line. And this classic line cancellation task is a case where the patient, just in free vision, has been asked to strike through all the lines they can see, and they've not done that with the ones on the left at all, but they've repeatedly done it with the ones on the right. Okay, so here's a really classic study, really a case report rather than a study, that it was the beginning of a much more extensive body of work. But I just want to talk about this simple study, partly because it's the one that's always cited still and widely discussed even to this day. I just read Hak-Wan Lau's new book on consciousness, which is a really interesting book, and it talks about this study. And it suffices, I think, to make the basic point about a lot of the work. So here a patient called PS with severe neglect was shown these two houses just on cards and asked the following questions. Are these houses the same or different? And she says they're the same. Is there anything wrong with either card? Nope. Okay, but which house would you prefer to live in? And understandably, she says that's a silly question, but when forced to make a response, she chooses this non-burning one on 9 of the 11 trials. Okay, that's why it's not a study, but just the 9 of the 11 trials. But this is someone who's just had a stroke, probably. Okay, what do the authors say? Well, they say that these preference judgments clearly indicate covert knowledge without conscious perceptual awareness, showing unconscious perceptual analysis far more extensive, as I said, than is dreamt of in our current theories. So what are they thinking? Well, they're presumably thinking that she's seeing these flames. She can see this house is a burning house. That's what's driving her preference judgment. But that can't be conscious, because otherwise she would have said they were different or something was wrong with the two houses. The problem here again, though, is that these questions are very, very different questions to be asking someone. If you ask the question, are two things the same or different, you need yourself to make up your mind, like, well, how different do two things have to be before I count them as different? How much difference do there have to be? Similarly, if you're asked the question, is there anything wrong with either card, you have to make up your mind, well, how much has to be wrong before I say something is wrong? What is it for something to be wrong with something? Okay, so these are questions that are both biased in the sense that subjects show a tendency to say the same, even when there are visible differences between stimuli. So that would be a kind of way of being conservative towards making different judgments. And again, you might expect people to be conservative in saying something was wrong, because they might be hesitant to do that. In contrast, this is a slightly unusual, but it's a forced choice question. You have to pick one of these two houses. So you don't have the option of saying, well, I don't really care. I mean, she does say that, but then she's forced to guess. So once we see that, the pattern of responses here and in future experiments is just fully consistent with a picture on which what neglect has led to is some kind of degraded conscious awareness of the left-hand side of this object or the left-hand side of space. Maybe just something being a bit off with one of the houses, or something being slightly smudgy over there, or an asymmetry in the stimulus. And that's not sufficient to drive a different or yes response, but it is to bias her, to lead her to make this preference judgment. So, I mean, maybe it's a bit like this. I don't know whether you can see anything in the left-hand side of space there, but there's just this kind of slight smudging. Okay, so let's go back to our dilemma. So that's subjective measures and how they crop up in two kind of critical cases. But what if we adopt a more rigorous objective test of awareness and insist that a stimulus just has to be completely undetectable to count as unconscious? That would rule out blindside and neglect as cases of unconscious perception, or at least clear cases of such. But it would also overcome this problem with the criterion. Okay, so if we do that, then I think a different issue arises. And the key point here is if the subject cannot detect the stimulus, we need some other way of showing that they've seen it. And a standard way of doing that would be to do a priming study and show some priming effect. So we might present the subject with this arrow here, mask it shortly afterwards in such a way that perhaps the prime is undetectable, and then follow it up with a consciously perceived target to which we ask the subject to respond in some way. So maybe they just press left or right, and it turns out that their right responses are marginally faster when a congruent right prime has preceded it. Okay, let's assume we do get such effects. The issue, though, here is that the priming effect itself can be understood simply in terms of the automatic activation of some subsystem of the individual. So maybe their visual system, or maybe their visual motor system. You can think of this prime as, activating representations in your early visual areas that, since activated, will lead to this target being perceived slightly faster if they're congruent as opposed to incongruent. Or maybe the motor response has been activated, and so you're slightly faster to fire it off when you see this target. But perception isn't a state of your primary visual cortex or of your supplementary motor area or any of these parts of your brain, nor even of a cognitive subsystem of yours. It's a state that you're in. You're the perceiver. You perceive things. So we can't just conclude from an effect that shows an effect on a subsystem that you yourself have perceived something. So I call this a problem of attribution. And it's I think, extremely difficult question as to how we should solve this problem. Like, what are the marks of the individual level? But a kind of widely agreed mark, and I say mark advisedly because many people would say it wasn't necessary or sufficient, but just a good guide of the individual level, is if a state or an episode or representation is directly available to guide action. So if a subject can use that representation to make some choice or to guide their action in some purposive way, then we should think of it as an individual level representation. And these primes aren't available to do that. So the action is guided by this target here. These simply modulate the way you end up responding to this in some modest way. But as a result of this kind of dilemma in the setup, a lot of the debate, and Brian mentioned Ned, so here are some of the many things I've written in debate with Ned about these issues, has really come to focus on this issue of unconscious action guidance. So the reason for that is that if we could find compelling evidence of unconscious action guidance, that gets around the problem of attribution, and so does provide a case of kind of a clear counterexample to the Golden Braid. And these are some other papers, which again, by Josh Shepard and Mirta Homopoulos and Jake Berger, which again kind of press the same thought. So in the last part of the talk, I want to talk about a couple of these cases. Okay, so in the background here is a canonical framework for thinking about visuomotor action due to Mel Goodale and David Milner here, called the so-called two visual systems hypothesis. And very, very roughly, this hypothesis says that when visual signal goes on from primary visual cortex, it proceeds in two anatomically and functionally separate streams. Okay, the first pathway, which is a kind of a ventral pathway here, Milner and Goodale dub vision for perception, since in their view, it is responsible for the construction of conscious representations of our environments, representations which get stored in memory and are then used for making judgments, recognizing, categorizing, and also thinking about the world and planning future actions. And a second pathway here, that Milner-Goodale called vision for action, and which is claimed to be responsible for the online control of our visually guided actions, so reaching and grasping and so on. And a critical part of this framework has it that the information in this dorsal stream is completely unconscious. Okay? In principle, cannot be accessed consciously. This has been hugely influential in philosophy. I won't read out these quotations, but here's Andy Clark. The context of his rejection of the Golden Braid is precisely this, insisting that the involvement of this dorsal information in our online action control is just completely immense and pervasive, again raising a question about why we need to be conscious at all. Here's Britt Brogard saying something very similar, arguing that actually we're never really consciously aware of exactly what we're doing because all of what we're doing at a moment is being guided by the dorsal stream. That's not to say there's not been pushback in philosophy. So there's a very nice paper by John Schwankler and Rob Briscoe from a few years ago saying that there's the two visual systems hypothesis too crude, that there's plenty of evidence that the spatial contents of visual experience, i.e. ventral stream representations, are in fact involved in online motor guidance and programming. But even they are not interested in objecting to the idea that there's just masses of empirical evidence that there are non-conscious sources of information that do significantly influence our bodily actions. Okay, so why think that the dorsal stream representation is unconscious? I think there are two basic reasons, and so here's Josh Shepard and Mirta Homopoulos asking and answering that question, citing these two sources. They say the first source of evidence involves visuomotor pointing tasks, and the second involves this case of visual for Magnisia, in particular patient DF. So let me just talk about those. This is actually a really old body of work. It's one of the luxuries of being a philosopher is that you can, cite work from 50 years ago, and that's okay. But I think it's really important to go back to the foundations of these things and reassess them sometimes. So this is work that goes back to Bruce Bridgman in the early 80s, I guess it kind of came to its full flourishing with Marc Généreux here. Mel Goodale did a bunch of this work. There's a huge research program here, and it's still widely appealed to by philosophers. But here are two classic tasks. So in this task from Goodale, Pellisson, and Preblanc from '86, the subject will be sat in front of a target, and your task is to wait for that target to jump to your right, and then to reach out immediately and point to it. So the target's going to jump, you point to it. In 50% of the trials, though, the target is going to jump an extra 10%. You're not told about this, but this is just the case. So it's going to jump an extra 3 to 5 centimeters just as you're saccading, just as you're moving your eyes to that target. So under these conditions, subjects never notice that there is any extra jump. It's timed to coincide with their eye movement, so it's kind of hidden. But nonetheless, they adjust their trajectory as if the target had basically immediately gone to that location. So there's just no difference in the trajectories of the jump targets as opposed to one that was sent there originally. And on that basis, Goodale and colleagues say, look, this is just a clear demonstration that the neural mechanisms mediating the perception of target position can be dissociated from those mediating visually guided reaching movements, a dissociation reminiscent of the behavior of cortically blind patients. It's actually a repeated refrain in this literature that Blindside has set up something that constantly gets referred back to. Okay, here's the second experiment, very similar, by Castiello and colleagues from Marc Généreux's lab. You as a subject again sat in front of some targets. This time they're these translucent dowels which can be illuminated. And your task initially is just to wait for the dowel to light up and then reach out towards it. And also to make the sound tar, just to say tar out loud. Just a meaningless vocalization. But in the critical session, trials all began with the second dowel being illuminated. But then in the minority, in 20% of the trials, the light would jump to the left or to the right. Subjects were told this would happen. And in these perturbated trials, they were instructed to just track the shift. So instead of going to the middle one, now go left or right. And then say tar again to indicate that they'd consciously experienced the visual change that had taken place. Okay, so second one goes on, you say tar immediately, then it jumps, and then you say tar again and reach out to it. Looking at the motor correction that occurs in this study, the experimentalists established that the reaction time, i.e. the time it takes between the jump happening and the hand trajectory changing, is about 100 milliseconds. But the vocal reaction time was much longer, nearly 420 milliseconds on average. So it took nearly, over 300 milliseconds for between the change in the movement and the vocalization to come. And indeed, on some occasions, they report the dissociation was so striking that to try and surprise, subjects were already lifting the first or third dowel by the time they were emitting that vocal response. So what does this show? Well, the thought is, that's given in the paper is that this extra 300 milliseconds is the time required for conscious perceptual experience to be generated. But you don't need conscious perceptual experience to guide your actions. Those are guided by this other system that what later becomes identified as this vision for action pathway. So again, these results are said to show a clear dissociation between motor responses and awareness, like Blindside. And this is from a textbook, this picture, and that's what the textbook tells you. It's possible to dissociate behavior and conscious awareness. But I think there's a much simpler explanation of what's going on in these tasks. And to see this, just reflect that in order to accurately point or reach out towards a target, you only have to represent its current location. You don't care where it was or where it will be. You just need to know where it is now, in the moment. But that does not suffice for you to detect a change. To detect a change, you need to do a whole bunch of other things, especially if that change has been hidden from you by occurring during a saccade. You need to encode the original location of the target. You need to maintain that representation. You need to retrieve it when the new occasion comes around, and you need to compare those two representations. So there's a whole sequence of steps that need to take place if you're going to accurately judge there's been a change. Okay, and so to kind of give you a sense of that, and if you've seen this before, I apologize, but I just want you to indulge me by staring at the next slide for 30 seconds and see if you spot anything unusual. Okay, so maybe I've spoiled it by just showing that, but this was the final slide you saw. And I don't know whether any of you realized, who hadn't seen it before, but this was the original slide. Okay? So massive change in color. If you're anything like me, you did not notice when you first saw this. Okay? But the last thing that you want to conclude from this is that we don't see colors. Okay? What this shows you, presumably, is that you can accurately represent the color of something at any particular moment, even though you fail across time to do that whole procedure of maintaining, retrieving, and comparing accurately. Okay, so this is just a classic example of change blindness, and the point to be made about change blindness is that the failure to notice the change doesn't in itself mean you didn't see the particular feature that changed at the moment before or after the change. And I really think the same thing is going on here. The failure to notice an extra jump in the target doesn't mean that you don't consciously perceive the target position effectively throughout the experiment. So there's not a clear demonstration here of a dissociation between mechanisms mediating the perception of target position and those mediating the visually guided reaching movements. Both might be accurate representations of the current target position. What there's been a failure of is a failure to detect a change. But that wasn't necessary to do the reaching task. And nor is it necessary to see the accurate position of the target consciously. And the same, I think, is true here. The course correction reflects that you've accurately updated your representation of the target's current location, like where the light currently is. But remember, tar was meant to be the signal of your conscious experience of a visual change. So have you detected and do you feel able to judge that a change has occurred? And you might then think that that detection process requires some extra time to go through some of those processing steps, the retrieval, the comparison, and so on. And that's what's explaining the delay, not the time needed for conscious experience. So again, I don't think there's evidence for dissociation here. Okay, let me now just finally talk about the second set of evidence. And again, this is going to be extremely brief and extremely narrow, but I'm more than happy to talk about other cases in the Q&A. So patient DF, who has this condition called visual for Magnisia, suffered very badly, actually, from carbon monoxide poisoning and had sort of extensive lesions. But in particular, she has extensive lesions on both sides to her ventral stream. So remember the stream that Milner and Goodell call vision for perception, that's associated with these conscious representations of our visual environment. And she's not blind because V1 was largely spared, and she can see color, she can see texture, but she has real problems with object recognition. She struggles to see size, shape, orientation, and so forth. And just to give you some sense of that, here's an imaging study in which she and here controls are shown these line drawings, and the activity elicited in these ventral pathways when presented with these line drawings is compared to the scrambled versions here. And so in the control subjects, you can see there's extensive differential activity in presence of this bed and this pepper compared to the scrambling, but in DF, there's absolutely no differential activity to be seen. And yet, despite that, she appears to have really quite impressive abilities for visually guided action. So let me just talk about one particular case of that. Very famous experiment done by Milner and Goodell back in the 90s, early 90s, where DF was just asked to look at this orientable slot and do one of two things. Either to hold a card and at a distance match the orientation of the slot with the card, or reach out and post it through the slot. Okay. And I'll show you a video of her doing this in a sec, but here's the pattern of data. She's incredibly bad at this matching task. These are kind of normalized to the vertical, but you can see that her performance there is almost random, whereas in the visuomotor posting task, she's not perfect or not exactly like control subjects, but incredibly close. So this is the standard story that's then told about this pattern of data, and this is a quotation from Ned Block. DF is almost as good at posting as our normal controls, but nearly random at matching. What explains this? Well, her conscious mind can't see orientation. That's why she can't do the matching task. Nonetheless, it must be that orientation is perceived, otherwise how could she do the posting task? Well, that must be perceived in this unconscious action guiding part of her brain. So here is her doing the matching task. Let me just show you one example of that. You can already see this is, I'll just wait for the experimenter to reorient the slot. Okay, and now she's being asked to match. Okay, so, and this goes on, and every time there's really no relation you can see between the. Okay, but here's the more impressive thing. Here is a case of the slot being moved and her being asked to reach out and post through it. Okay, so really a remarkable dissociation. Problem is, again, there's an alternative explanation of what's going on. And the thing is that needs recognizing is that you don't need to be able to perceive orientation to do the posting task. And that's because there's another way of doing it. You can succeed in posting by using what's called an obstacle avoidance strategy. And what that involves is you seeking to minimize the distances between the edges of the slot and the edges of the card. Maximize the distances, not minimize them. So if you can create maximum safety margin or room between the edges of the slot and the edges of the card, you will post successfully. And in fact, you don't actually, orientation is kind of neither necessary nor sufficient for doing the task. If you know the orientation, you still can't do the task unless you know the midpoint. But if you don't know the orientation and you do know that as held like this, you've managed to maximize the distances between the card and the slot edge, then you will be able to do the task. So this strategy is strictly orientation free. Okay, but is there any evidence this is what's actually going on? Well, the first piece of evidence that was proposed for this account comes from a paper by Hess, Franz, and Schenk from 2011. And what they do is they modify the slot so that actually the orientation where there's the maximum safety margin is not the vertical of the slot, but it's diagonal. So it's a wide slot, but they use very big cards. And what they find, this is just neurotypical subjects, is that the orientation error, namely the departure from that vertical, is pretty large in about half of the subjects, suggesting that about half of the subjects do in fact post through this slot with a not orienting to the slot's orientation, but rather maximizing the safety margin. And interestingly, there's no relation between their matching behavior and whether they do that or whether they stick to this strategy or not. So this is some suggestive evidence. But in response to this, Block in particular, but others too, have been rather unimpressed. They say, well, this is just very weak evidence. This is a very weak criticism of the original study for three reasons. One, look, that a task that's been deliberately designed to elicit obstacle avoidance does so in normal subjects doesn't show anything about what DF is doing. Second, as you saw in the video I showed you, DF moves her hand forward unhesitatingly and almost always inserts the card smoothly into the slot, Block says. And she also begins to rotate the card towards the correct orientation well in advance of arriving at it. And finally, he says that he thinks orientation perception would be required to avoid hitting the edge of the slot with the card. Now, I just think that's not correct, although he doesn't say any more than this, so I don't know precisely the thinking. But I do not think it's true that you need orientation to succeed in this task. With respect to this criticism, I think this would be correct as a criticism if there was somehow an obvious difference between the subjects who used the strategy in the Hess paper. But actually they also, if you look at the details, all had adjusted the card to that, as it were, diagonal orientation by midway through their trajectories. And they all posted smoothly and effortlessly in a similar way. So really the key point here is that this difference in strategy doesn't predict that you wouldn't be able to do a smooth posting movement or that you wouldn't be able to get the orientation in advance. It's just a difference in the information being used. But the first point is, I think, absolutely right, that we can't generalize too much from this early study. But I now think there's stronger evidence, and this comes from the same group from a much more recent paper, and it exploits an effect known as the oblique effect. So all of us are reliably more accurate in judging horizontal and vertical orientations than oblique orientations. So, cardinal orientations are just, if you look around the room, you'll see they're all over the place. We're very, very used to them, and our visual systems are very used to them. So we're better at discriminating horizontals and verticals than oblique orientations. So if posting were to be based on orientation, you'd expect it to show an oblique effect. If it's based on an obstacle avoidance strategy, which is orientation-free, you wouldn't. So just as proof of concept, here's evidence from a matching paradigm, which does show an oblique effect. So in both these two conditions, here the open loop means the subjects can't see the target as soon as they've begun the movement, so that's why the errors are larger. You're seeing errors in the matching of an orientation, and you can see they're much lower with the horizontal and verticals here than with the obliques. What about posting? No such effect. Okay, there is a pattern in this data though, and which some of you know that will have spotted. Looks like errors are increasing in this direction. Well, that's because they all started from the same kind of post-horizontal rotation position. So we can fix that, as the experimentalists did, by using variable starting positions. And we can also do one other thing that's important. We can introduce a delay between the presentation of the target and the action being made. And that's important because it's natural to worry or think that maybe the two visual systems people will say, but maybe the dorsal stream, maybe our action guiding stream doesn't have an oblique effect associated with it. Maybe that's just a ventral stream thing. But those people, Goodale and Milner, do think that once you introduce a delay, our actions fall back on ventral stream representations. So action guiding representations are supposed to be kind of on the fly, in the moment representations, which are used in online guidance. But when we're falling back on memory, we use the ventral stream. So this delay ought to definitely get us an oblique effect if there is one to be found. Of course, here's the matching data, again showing such an effect, but here's the posting data, again showing no such effect. So this is all data for neurotypical subjects, but what this is really suggesting is that neurotypical subjects don't use orientation information primarily in guiding their posting. We're using obstacle avoidance strategies. Okay, so in general, subjects use orientation-free obstacle avoidance strategies, or at least, that really is evidence that they're orientation-free, not specifically their obstacle avoidance, but in their posting. And so our default hypothesis now should be that DF is doing that. And if that's right, then her performance on the posting task clearly doesn't establish that she's perceived the orientation of the slot in an unconscious action guiding part of her brain. The simplest thing to say is that she just can't see orientation. Okay, I'm over the time that I said I would speak for, so I'm going to wrap up now. But there's a huge number of other bits of evidence that I could have mentioned. But this is the real take-home I want to leave you with. What I've argued is that across a very diverse range of cases, and for a whole set of different reasons, these apparently striking dissociations of performance and awareness that you have seen in Blindside and neglect may in fact be specious or artifactual in different ways. So in the case of Blindside and neglect, it was the problem of the criterion, which I pointed to. In the case of subliminal priming, it's not so much the effect is specious or artifactual there, it's that there's a gap between the data and what it shows and the anything that the Golden Braid is talking about, namely perception by us and our actions. In the case of those visual motor action studies, the point was that there's a conflation or a misunderstanding of what is being shown by a failure to detect change. It doesn't show that we're not tracking a feature. And in the case of visual full magnosia, and this would apply to many other studies of visual full magnosia, there are just different strategies that can be used to do different tasks. And so when you compare two tasks, you need to be very, very sure that the same strategy is being applied in both. Okay, this then returns us to this naive vision I began with, which Clark paints, on which perception is always conscious and always available for action guidance, and all action guidance occurs with conscious perception. And I'm not really standing here today saying this is the truth. What I am trying to stand here and say is that this is our starting point and we shouldn't abandon it without extremely good evidence, and the evidence that I've surveyed I don't think is decisive evidence. So not everything that's naive or intuitive should be given up upon. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ian. That was fantastic. And we will now open the floor for a few questions.
Thank you very much, Ian. It's an extremely interesting paper. In your debate with Ned Block, I find myself wondering what you regard as the minimal condition for it being true that something is conscious or aware of anything. It seems as though you and Block had a clear idea of what it was to be consciously aware of something, and you were arguing about that. But looking at the data, one might wonder whether, first of all, awareness isn't a matter of degree, secondly, whether it's vague, and thirdly, whether there is a determinate cut-off point at the bottom level. So I was wondering whether you could say what you regard as the minimal condition for the presence of consciousness to be.
Yeah, thanks. That's a huge question with many questions built into it. So maybe one answer is just I can't give you an answer to that question. So I think there is a slight difference between us, but also a bit of agreement. So I think we're both agreed that the interest is in phenomenal consciousness, both Ned and I. But I am inclined to impose a kind of access condition on that, which was an action condition I mentioned. So I guess I think one condition that is a plausible condition for a representation being conscious is that it's usable by the subject in some way. And I don't think that that Ned would necessarily, well, I'm pretty sure he wouldn't agree with that. They might be happy with the idea that there are conscious representations that just are completely inaccessible. Then there's the question of degrees. I do think there's a way in which we can make sense of consciousness, or at least of a certain kind of episode as being more or less conscious. But I also think that's not inconsistent with it being either true or false that it is a conscious episode or not. You see what I mean? So when we talk about degraded vision or a very, very weak signal, I think that gives us some operational grip on it being a conscious to a low degree, as it were. But I still think there's a matter of fact about whether it's conscious or not. And then, might it be indeterminate or might it be vague? I don't want to rule that out at all. Nothing I've said is committed to that. And I don't really know if there's anything in our naive or intuitive view which says there's always a determinate fact of the matter. But feel free to press me more on things I've just said, or.
I find this all very convincing, but I'm not familiar with debates, but it's still convincing. But what do you think motivates people like Block to insist that performance and awareness can be dissociated? What's in it for them, as it were, in taking this line? Is there a philosophical motivation, or is there something that they're not concerned with that you're concerned with that can explain this difference?
That's a really interesting question. I feel like I shouldn't try and peer into Ned's soul, but I kind of think it's particularly interesting in his case because he has this distinction between phenomenal and access consciousness. And once you've got that distinction, you might think, well, why not think that many of these cases are cases of phenomenal without some form of access? So that was in ways the question that first got me interested in this area, and it's kind of a question for Ned. So he has, nonetheless, though, decided that as he sees the evidence, it points to a kind of tripartite distinction between this unconscious, truly unconscious, phenomenally conscious, and access consciousness. I do think he's seriously guided by the empirical evidence in this case. And so I think that's what he would reply, and very reasonably so. Many, many people, actually with very different views of consciousness to his, see these cases as being, absolutely clear demonstrations of things. So, I mean, in ways, I think there's a kind of a really legitimate deference to science that's going on in a lot of philosophy. But I think there's also an insufficient attention to the assumptions that are going into the interpretation of these studies, which is so maybe there shouldn't have been quite so much, in my view.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I have to confess I'm very new to all of this, so I wanted to ask a very basic question. So it seemed that the Golden Braid is tying together three things: perception, conscious perception, and action guidingness. And it seemed like the debates over the evidence was about whether it's conscious perception that's action guiding or whether we have unconscious perception that's action guiding. And I wondered if you could say something about the link between perception and acting guidingness in general, such that I'm not quite sure how to articulate it. Can the two be pulled apart, or is there something about the way in which we investigate psychologically where it can't be pulled apart because we're looking at people's behaviors, and as we ruled out the subjective measures, what happens there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think there's something slightly terminological here. So when Milner and Goodale say that this visual stream that guides action is vision for action, they contrast it with vision for perception. So as they're talking about perception, they're talking about something that's conscious or at least potentially conscious. So then the question, is all action guidance perceptual, is a real one, because we're getting this contrast between information that's coming in, as it were, through the senses that's genuinely perceptual, and information which isn't because it's going with this dorsal pathway. And my first move was to say, as part of the Golden Braid, all perception is conscious, and then the contrast that they have can't exist at that point. So your question then becomes, well, is there anything else? Is there any other source of information that could be action guiding that wasn't perceptual? Now, I actually think that it's not totally obvious there isn't, but it would be some kind of, as it were, extrasensory information that was guiding our actions in an online way, and I don't know what exactly that would be. So, I'm not actually certain it's in the Golden Braid that's all ruled out, but I don't think it's part of our naive conception that there are other ways of information coming in that aren't via the senses that are available for action guidance. Of course, there's information that's stored and used independently of current perception that guides our action. We can act, as it were, on the basis of that. Did you have anything in mind, or?
No, I didn't have anything in mind, but I was wondering, so the direction you're going is whether perception, like what are the sources for action guidingness? And I was wondering about the other direction, such that could you just have perception that isn't action guiding in some way? Or maybe I just don't know what it means for something to be action guiding in the relevant
Yeah,
sense.
you're right. So the kind of cases that someone like Block might point to, where alleged cases where you have perception, conscious perception, but that's inaccessible, might count as cases where those representations, although they contribute to what it's like to be you, they're conscious, are not available for guiding actions. I happen to think there aren't any obvious such cases, but that's not really something I spoke at all significantly about today.
Let's, all right, Paul, one last question.
Thanks. I'll try to make it quick. It's a methodological question. Where are the qualitative data sources on these conditions? I thought it might be much easier to adjudicate between the Golden Braid view and Block's view by just asking people who have Blindside, what is your experience like, rather than putting them through these complicated tests. So where's the qualitative data here? Is there some barrier to interpreting qualitative data that is not easy to see? Or,
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I have looked very hard to kind of assemble, subjective reports of what it's like to have blind sight in the literature, and there are a bunch actually. So the claim that GY makes in an interview that he's lost all vision to his right is undermined by his own reports when he says things like, sometimes I can see orientation, but then I lose all form, or as if there's some kind of failures of, might describe it as like a failure of binding of features, that you can see one type of feature at a time. He sometimes talks about how his vision is a bit like what a normally sighted, he uses the word man, would experience if they were looking out at a bright light with their eyes closed and wave their hand between the light and their hand or something like that. And he uses these lovely phrases like black on black, like a mouse under a blanket. So he has these evocative descriptions of his own experience. So there is qualitative work. And it's also this amazing paper, though, that I think really does expose what might be problematic about some of this data. So it's actually a Hak-Wan Lau paper. And it's a super interesting approach, but I think at least the philosophers in the room will smile at it. So what they decided they needed to do with patient GY, who's really the most extensively studied paper, was get GY to understand what qualia are. So they got these passages from, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, from like Jackson and Tai and whoever, and said, read this. And he's a very, dedicated subject and reads his own literature. So he read the philosophical literature, and do you have these? And if you look at what he was given, he was actually given these kinds of the bright blue of the Pacific Ocean, that, the fresh smell of coffee in the morning, kind of descriptions of qualia. And so what he said was, no, I don't, except on the very high contrast trials, basically. So I just think this problem of the criterion is present in any kind of subjective report. It's just the psychophysical work uses it in a much narrow and more controlled environment.
So let's thank